Zambia is treading new ground in Africa, becoming the first country in the continent to accept China's currency, the Yuan, for mining taxes. A move that underscores Beijing's growing financial influence in Africa's critical resource industries. Zambia is the continent's second largest copper producer, and the nation's bank confirmed that mining tax payments in Yuan began in October, marking a significant change in how Zambia manages revenue from its mining sector.
A single sentence slipped out of a press release in southern China, and almost nobody noticed it. Not Washington, not Brussels, not the IMF. Just this: Zambia will accept Chinese yuan for mining taxes and royalties. It didn't sound dramatic, it didn't sound revolutionary, it sounded boring. But inside Western banks, risk models lit up, because that sentence quietly broke a rule that has kept Africa under control for 60 years. For decades, Zambia mined the copper that powers smartphones, electric cars, and data centers, yet it stayed trapped in debt and austerity. Not because it lacked resources, but because every dollar of its wealth had to pass through Western financial gatekeepers first. So Zambia didn't protest, it didn't threaten. It simply rewired the system, in Guangzhou, not Washington. And in doing so, it asked the most dangerous question in global finance. What happens when Africa no longer needs the dollar to survive? Let's find out. Before we can understand why Zambia's Yuan decision shook the global system, we have to understand the rule that quietly governed Africa for 70 years, a rule no one ever voted for, yet every African country was forced to live under. Zambia did not stay poor because it lacked copper, talent, or ambition. It stayed poor because the money its wealth was priced in did not belong to it. Every ton of copper was sold in US dollars. Every tax payment had to be made in US dollars, and every debt obligation was serviced in US dollars, which meant that Zambia did not control its own financial bloodstream. Even when copper exports surged, Zambia could still collapse into crisis the moment dollar liquidity dried up, because Western banks, not the Zambian state, decided when money could flow. This is why hospitals ran out of supplies, fuel queues appeared overnight, and food prices exploded, even while copper shipments were leaving Zambian soil daily for global markets. This was not a failure of governance. It was a system designed to keep Africa dependent. The dollar was not just a currency, it was a control mechanism. When Zambia needed dollars, Western banks set the terms. When it needed credit, Western rating agencies decided whether it lived or died financially. And when Zambia resisted, the IMF arrived with rescue packages that demanded subsidy cuts, mass layoffs, and the sale of national assets to foreign corporations, all wrapped in the language of reform and responsibility. The West called this a free market. Africa experienced it as financial captivity, where wealth flowed out effortlessly but survival required permission. The tragedy is that Zambia was rich the entire time. Its copper-powered smartphones, electric vehicles, military systems, and the global green transition. Yet its people were told they were poor because the system said so, because they did not control the currency that their wealth lived inside. When you do not control the money, you do not control the future. This is why Africa exported prosperity and imported austerity for decades, and why Zambia eventually reached the only logical conclusion: the problem was not copper. It was the rule that forced copper to bow to Washington before it could serve Africa. And once that truth became unavoidable, a dangerous question emerged that no African country had ever dared to answer before. What happens when Africa stops obeying the dollar? Zambia did not escape the dollar trap by making speeches or threatening the West. It escaped by redesigning its economy quietly, far away from Washington, in a place most Western diplomats were not watching: Guangzhou. Instead of lining up at IMF offices to beg for another rescue package, Zambian officials walked into the China SCO Economic and Trade Exchange Center and did something far more dangerous to the old order. They rewired how money, industry, and trade connect. This center is not a showroom for handshakes and photo ops. It is an operating system that links Chinese manufacturers, Asian financiers, and Eurasian logistics into one machine, and Zambia plugged itself directly into it. By doing this, Zambia removed the Western middlemen who had controlled African trade for decades and replace them with a straight line into the world's largest industrial ecosystem. Once that bridge was built, Zambia changed the rule that mattered most, the currency rule. It announced that Chinese mining companies could now pay their taxes and royalties in Chinese yuan instead of US dollars. On paper, this looks like a technical adjustment. In reality, it is the master key. This single change collapsed 3 layers of Western control at once. First, Chinese firms no longer needed to buy dollars from Western banks just to operate in Africa, which removed Western financial institutions from the heart of Zambia's mining economy. Second, Zambia no longer needed to hoard scarce dollars just to collect its own revenue, which stabilized the kwacha and weakened the currency crises that had repeatedly pushed the country into IMF bailouts. Third, the entire logic of dependency broke, because Zambia aligned its money with its real trading partner instead of with a distant empire. This is what economic decolonization actually looks like. It does not arrive with flags or slogans. It arrives with boring, precise financial engineering that changes who controls the system. By collecting taxes in yuan, Zambia kept its wealth inside a circuit it could manage instead of losing it to Western clearinghouses, conversion fees, and financial gatekeepers. Copper stopped being a hostage to the dollar and became a lever Zambia could finally pull for itself. This is why the West is nervous. The power it used to exercise through currency shortages, debt pressure, and financial blackmail no longer works the same way once Africa can operate outside the dollar cage.
Zambia is an important country on the African continent. Under your leadership over the years, Zambia has pursued reform and grown the economy, achieving significant outcomes. China is very happy for Zambia, and we would like to congratulate Zambia. Last year, our 2 countries jointly commemorated the 60th anniversary of our diplomatic relations, and you visited China for the FOCAC Beijing Summit. You and President Xi Jinping had a meeting during which you made new plans and guidance for the growth of China-Zambia relations.
So, Zambia did not do this blindly. It matched its currency shift with industrial alignment. Copper is no longer just an export rock. It is the raw material for batteries, electric vehicles, data centers, and renewable energy infrastructure, all of which China dominates globally. By connecting directly into that industrial ecosystem, Zambia positioned itself inside the future economy instead of selling its future cheaply to the past. This is the escape route: currency sovereignty plus industrial partnership working together as one system. And once Zambia proved that this route exists, a question began to spread quietly across the continent, from Kinshasa to Luanda to Windhoek. If Zambia can walk out of the dollar prison, why can't we? When Zambia flipped its currency switch, nothing exploded and no sirens went off. But inside Western finance, something far more serious happened. Control disappeared. For decades, the United States and Europe did not dominate Africa because they were morally persuasive or economically generous. They dominated because they controlled the infrastructure of money. The dollar sat at the center of everything: trade, debt, sanctions, insurance, shipping, and credit. And that gave Washington a silent weapon more powerful than any army. If an African government stepped out of line, dollars became scarce. Banks froze accounts. Credit ratings collapsed. And within months, the country was back at the IMF negotiating its survival. This was not diplomacy. It was financial discipline. Zambia's Yuan decision cut straight through that machinery. Once Chinese mining firms could operate and pay taxes without touching the dollar, the West lost its choke point. Western clearinghouses no longer sat between Africa's minerals and Africa's revenue. Western rating agencies could no longer threaten to shut down Zambia's financial oxygen, and the IMF could no longer use dollar shortages as a pressure tool to force privatization and austerity. The lever that had controlled Africa for 70 years simply stopped working the way it used to. This is why Western media suddenly began talking about a weakening dollar and currency fragmentation. They are not worried about exchange rates in isolation. They are worried about losing monopoly power. The dollar's dominance was never just about convenience. It was about control. It allowed the West to decide who could trade, who could borrow, and who could govern without punishment. Zambia's move signals that this era is ending, not with a crash, but with a quiet rerouting of global money flows that makes the old tools irrelevant. The most uncomfortable part for the West is that this is legal, peaceful, and impossible to stop. No sanction can force Zambia to use dollars again. No invasion can rebuild a currency monopoly. The system only works if Africa agrees to participate in it, and Zambia has demonstrated that participation is a choice, not a destiny. Once that truth is visible, the fear spreads faster than any protest. Because if one country can escape the dollar cage without collapsing, then the entire architecture of Western dominance in Africa becomes a historical accident rather than an inevitability. And that is the real loss. The West did not just lose a financial advantage. It lost the story that said Africa needed it to survive. It lost the narrative that said development flows only through Western institutions. Zambia has shown that Africa can build, trade, and grow outside the empire's currency walls, and that revelation is more dangerous than any policy change. Because once Africa sees the door is open, it will not unsee it. And when that happens, the question no longer belongs to Zambia alone. It belongs to the entire continent. If the West has lost its grip, who now shapes Africa's future? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Zambia did not choose China because of ideology, slogans, or speeches about South-South solidarity. It chose China because China solved the one problem the West never wanted to solve: production. For decades, Western policy toward Africa revolved around extraction without transformation. Minerals were dug out, shipped away, and turned into wealth somewhere else. When African leaders asked for factories, power stations, and industrial capacity, they were told to liberalize markets, improve governance, and wait for investment that never arrived. The West was comfortable with Africa as a mine. It was terrified of Africa as a manufacturer. China walked into that vacuum with a completely different logic. Instead of telling Zambia to fix itself before it could develop, China built the tools that make development possible. Power stations came first, because mines and factories cannot run on speeches. Smelters followed, so copper could be processed inside Africa instead of being exported as raw rock. Railways and logistics corridors were built to collapse transport costs and tie inland minerals to global supply chains. Industrial parks followed, giving Zambia the physical space to turn copper into batteries, components, and infrastructure for the electric future. This was not charity. It was an industrial strategy, and Zambia recognized it immediately. By aligning with China, Zambia did not just find a buyer for its copper, it found a partner in its industrialization. China dominates the global battery, electric vehicle, and renewable energy supply chain, and copper is the backbone of all three. Instead of selling raw copper cheaply into a Western system that kept Africa poor, Zambia plugged its minerals directly into the world's fastest-growing industrial machine. The Yuan settlement was not a financial trick. It was the glue that held this industrial partnership together, ensuring that money, production, and trade moved in the same direction instead of leaking back to the West. The contrast with the West is brutal. Europe and the United States talked endlessly about development while blocking African industrial policy through trade rules, intellectual property regimes, and IMF conditions. China simply built. And that is why Zambia trusted China. Not because China is perfect, but because China offered a path out of poverty that actually worked. Infrastructure first, industry second, sovereignty always. This is why the West lost. It refused to treat Africa as a civilization capable of production and power. China treated Africa as a future industrial partner. Zambia chose the side that offered a future, not a lecture. And by making that choice, it exposed the deepest fear in Western capitals, that Africa no longer needs their approval to rise. Because if China can industrialize Africa without Western permission, then the old development story collapses. The gatekeepers become spectators. And the most dangerous question of all emerges, not in Washington, but in African capitals themselves. If China made this escape possible for Zambia, What happens when the rest of Africa walks through the same door? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Once Zambia showed that the dollar was not a law of nature but a choice, the most dangerous thing in geopolitics happened. Other countries started doing the math. In Kinshasa, Luanda, Windhoek, and Accra, officials did not argue about ideology or alliances. They asked one cold, technical question. If Zambia can collect its mining taxes in Yuan, stabilize its currency, and grow without IMF chokeholds, why are we still bleeding through the dollar system? This is how revolutions actually spread, not with protests, but with spreadsheets. And the numbers point in one direction. Africa no longer needs Western financial gatekeepers to survive. The logic is irresistible because the resources are already there. The Democratic Republic of Congo controls the world's cobalt, the backbone of batteries and electric vehicles. Angola sits on massive oil and gas reserves that power Asia's growth. Namibia holds uranium that fuels nuclear reactors. Ghana controls gold that anchors financial systems. These are not marginal assets. They are the arteries of the 21st century economy. Once these countries align their currencies, trade routes, and industrial partnerships the way Zambia has, the dollar loses its African foundation, and with it, the West loses its most powerful lever. This is why the IMF and World Bank are suddenly talking about currency diversification and reform. They can see the ground shifting under their feet. Their entire business model depends on African countries needing dollars to function. When Africa no longer needs those dollars, the institutions that controlled African policy for decades become irrelevant. There is no bailout to negotiate, no conditionality to impose, no austerity to enforce. The empire does not collapse in flames, it simply stops being needed. The bigger change is psychological. Africa has been trained to believe it cannot survive without Western approval. Zambia shattered that myth. It showed that you can build power stations, smelters, and trade corridors without asking Washington for permission. It showed that currency sovereignty is not a fantasy, but an engineering problem that can be solved. And once that belief spreads, the old colonial logic dies. This is not chaos. This is the birth of a multipolar Africa, where trade flows east and south, where currencies reflect real partners, and where industrialization is planned, not postponed. The chain reaction is not about replacing one empire with another. It is about removing empires from Africa's future altogether. Zambia did not switch masters, it switched systems. And that is why the West is afraid. Because systems are harder to fight than governments. You can sanction a country. You cannot sanction a continent that no longer needs your currency. And once Africa realizes that its wealth, its industry, and its money can finally work together, the final question becomes unavoidable. Not for Zambia alone, but for the entire continent. If Africa can now stand on its own financial feet, who will ever be able to control it again? Africa did not break free by shouting. It broke free by redesigning the machinery of power. Zambia's decision to collect mining taxes in Yuan and plug directly into China's industrial ecosystem looks technical on the surface, but it is the most important political act Africa has made since independence, because it changes who controls the future. For the first time in modern history, an African state aligned its currency, its trade, and its industrial strategy into a single system that serves African survival instead of Western dominance. This is what real sovereignty looks like. Not flags and anthems, but control over the flows of money, goods, and production that decide whether a nation rises or falls. The most powerful part of this shift is not what Zambia gained, but what it no longer needs. It no longer needs IMF permission to breathe. It no longer needs Western banks to touch its wealth. It no longer needs Western narratives to explain its poverty. Zambia discovered that development is not a gift. It is an engineering problem, and Africa can solve it. Once that realization takes root, the psychology of dependency collapses, and with it, the entire architecture of post-colonial control. This is why the future now belongs to Africa, not as a charity case but as a strategic actor. Copper is no longer just a mineral. It is the foundation of the electric world, the digital world, and the industrial world, and Africa controls it. When Africa controls the currency that moves that copper, the factories that transform it, and the trade routes that deliver it, Africa controls the future. This is not optimism. This is arithmetic. The West tried to stop this future by keeping Africa trapped in a system where it could never industrialize, never control its currency, and never escape debt. That system is now collapsing, not because it was defeated, but because it was outgrown. Zambia did not overthrow the empire. It simply walked away from it and built something better. And this is the moment the story truly changes. Africa is no longer waiting to be saved. It is building itself, deliberately, intelligently, and without apology. The world is about to meet a continent that owns its money, its industry, and its destiny. So the final question is no longer whether Africa will rise. That is already happening. The only question left is this: who is ready to live in the world Africa is about to create? Let us know in the comment section. Is Africa finally on the right track? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.